Hello, everybody. My name is Emmanuel Ramos Barajas, and I am the producer of the Unsettling Journeys videos. Today, the lesson is called Inventing the Cannibal, and it's a complementary lesson to our previous episode titled Inventing el Indio and the Role of Print Culture. When working with this episode, I spent a lot of times looking at images from the period around Columbus and afterwards. And little by little, I came to the realization that as many images that I was seeing of Native Americans, of Indigenous peoples, of their religious practices, their foods, their clothings, their cities, everything, all of these images were made and produced in Europe by Europeans for Europeans. So there was never a sense of indigenous worldviews embedded in these images. And for me, that was a turning point where I began to rethink what these images meant and how I can utilize them in my teaching. And so today, the lesson is going to be based primarily looking at a chapter from Peter Holmes' book called Colonial Encounters, Europe and the Native Caribbean, 1492 to 1797. In this book, Peter Holmes is a historian who's tracing many colonial encounters, primarily in chapter 1, that of Columbus and the cannibals. That's the name of chapter 1. And I will begin where he begins, which is by defining cannibal and cannibalism. Holmes refers to the Oxford English Dictionary definition of cannibal. He quotes that definition, which is Cannibales comes from Spanish, and it's originally one of the forms of the ethnic names Caribs or Caribes, a fair nation of the West Indies who are recorded to have been anthropophagi, and from whom the name was subsequently extended as a descriptive terms. In more simpler terms, this is also from Oxford English Dictionary, but from the 1951 edition, man or animal that feeds on his own species, attributed to having this habit. So what Holmes describes in this chapter and what he really focuses on is the idea that they were attributed, being cannibals, attributed to eating each other. And through his historical tracking of the term, of the descriptions of how these things were written down as history, he comes to the realization that the terms where this is first used is Columbus's journal. But Columbus's journal is not a straightforward book or narrative. It is a writing that is filled with silences. So in tracking these silences, Holmes really sets up a deconstruction of what this term means and how we ultimately arrive to here. He makes a distinction of saying that Columbus, in his writing, has two forms of talking about the world. The first one is the Oriental discourse, which we will talk a little bit later, and that comes from Marco Polo. Columbus was reading Marco Polo, he was reading his journeys, but also Columbus comes from Europe. And in Europe, the history of savagery, the history of barbarism dates a very, very long time. Our first example comes from the Greeks, and specifically Herodotus, who lived circa 1484 to 1425 BCE in what is now modern-day Turkey. At this point, he came from Halicarnassus, which was part of the Persian Empire. Herodotus had a lot of questions as to how history was written down. In his major work, The Histories, it is a recollection of the Greco-Persian Wars. Coming from the Persian Empire and also being part of the Greek Empire, he gathered multiple points and embedded them with a narrative. Before this point, history was just kind of like, oh, the gods made this happen, and then there was a storm. Instead, Herodotus comes up with a narrative that says, first was this, then this led to this. So he gives a sequentiality to these events. And what is interesting is that in his talking about the world, in his talking about the Greco-Persian Wars, he also gives us a lot of rich details about the edges of the world. his perspective ultimately centered his Greek and Persian point of view. This is what the world looked like according to Herodotus. It is obviously centered around the Mediterranean. That's the place that the Greeks knew the best. And what's interesting is that he places the fabulous at the edges of the known world, just because it's far enough that you can't really confirm without having to travel all the way there. So the more people traveled, the more supposed the edges of the world were, the more extreme the conditions were. So his chapters relating to the periphery of the world are really filled with incredible creatures, natural wonders, alien customs, and idealized peoples. And what's important here is that by referencing these the ends of the world, he implies that he himself is at the center. And so everything that's on the edges is remote and weird. So he's really looking at the world, describing it, but through his own lens and applying his own perspective to what the people of Africa, Asia, and all the other edges were supposed to be like. And coming closer to Columbus, we have Marco Polo, who traveled the world. He traveled along the Silk Road between 1271 and 1295. He recorded his travels in a book, and this was the first, most recent look for Europe at the rest of the world, in Asia and Persia, India, Japan, and other regions. As we see here, these are illustrations from the book. This is supposed to be Marco Polo visiting Kublai Khan, who is Genghis Khan's grandson. The way that he has been rendered in this European image is so that it's recognizable for Europeans. He's sitting on a throne. People know that he's the king, but we see he looks kind of European. This is a portrait that was made in his own time, in his own place. So this is probably a more accurate and naturalistic view. But even then, this image, this portrait, has its own silences. This was made after Kublai Khan's death, and it was made so that he would look 30 years younger. So both of these images are supposed to represent a person in time, in space, but in reality, they're silences. And what's interesting about this is that Marco Polo's writings weren't just writings and text, they were also accompanied by illustrations to make them more exciting or understandable for European audiences. And so what we have here is just images that are filled with fantastical settings, with weird peoples, and all of these is consumed in Europe, and this is kind of taken at face value. While Marco Polo didn't exactly write, there's weird people and they have dog faces or whatever, he did say, I heard from someone that there are dog peoples in this part of the world. So in retrospect, when people are illustrating that, that's the most visual thing to illustrate, and that's what gets drawn. And so what we get here is that text and image are inextricably linked. Like there is a way that images always support the text, and in a way, images become much more powerful than the text itself. And so these are all precedents of what happened before Columbus arrived to the Caribbean. And this is Nuremberg's map from 1493, just 1 year after. So we see that there's still ideas of people who have multiple arms, multiple faces, one leg, they look like animals. And this is, in a way, scientific knowledge. It is printed, it is distributed, and whomever has access to these prints, to these maps, are going to have an idea about what the rest of the world looks like. And so we get to Columbus's letters. Peter Holm continues that Columbus wrote his journal, but his journal was lost and someone made a copy of it, and the copy was then read by someone who made a summary of the copy of the journal. And so in reality, we don't have a full account of the journal. What we do have, and what was the most distributed part of Columbus's writings, were his letters. So the journal he wrote while he was in the Caribbean every day, and the letter he wrote on his way back from the Caribbean on the journey back to Spain. And so this is a condensed version of the journal. And obviously, Columbus omits lots of facts. He emphasizes other facts, like saying, oh, these people are easily controllable, and there's some bad people, but I'm not going to talk about it. So in the journal, he writes extensively about the people who are bad, who are evil, who are cannibal. And in the letter, in order to entice the Catholic monarchs to keep putting money in his enterprise, he is just kind of exaggerating and diminishing facts as he sees fit. Now, what's of importance for us in this moment is that images were also made to accompany his letters. This is an image made for some of the first publications of those letters. And here you have Columbus's writing, describing what he found, that he found an island and it's new and it's invented. That's the word for found. So here we have Columbus. He's trading, it seems, with these naked people who are shy and hiding behind each other, and they're just kind of naked in a mass. There's the grand land behind them. It's an island. It's by the seas. And there's a clear contrast, as we have been saying in our videos, between the Europeans and the way that indigenous people are imagined. And so what happens is that whomever receives these letters, whoever has access to these letters and looks at these images, they have an established idea of what this world is like. This is another illustration from another letter from 1493. And we see the same kind of motif. We have indigenous people over here chanting Columbus in his boat. And across the ocean, we have the king pointing and dictating and mandating. This creates a superimposed hierarchy of like, this person is in charge, these people don't know what they're doing, we have to intervene somehow. And this creates a lot of silences, and it creates lots of myths. So in this text and these images, what ends up happening is that slowly they start becoming truth. And not only is it truth, it's a mere myths. And as Roland Barthes explains in his book Mythologies, myths are a system of communication, that is, a message, as well a type of speech chosen by history. It cannot possibly evolve from the nature of things. So he also says that it's not just necessary to invent something, to have a shorthand for what this thing is supposed to be, but also images, photography, cinema can all aid in the creation of this process. If you're a European in Europe and you've never left and you've gone to the Americas, you're going to read this first-hand witness account of what some person saw, some explorer, and you're going to read, oh, they're naked, they're savages, they eat each other. And because it is written down, it is in a book, it is printed, you're going to say, oh, this is true. And on top of that, you have an image that goes along with it that helps you imagine just exactly how it is. And what's interesting is that you have to keep in mind that most of the images that were made about the Americas were made by people who never visited this land. So you have people who do go to the Americas, who write about it, and then they send these writings back, and then some draftsman or engraver reads this text, and then they imagine what this is supposed to look like. So already in 1500, we see that the peoples of Brazil are cannibals. Not only are they wild and savage and naked, covered in feathers and, just leaves, very biblical, like Adam and Eve, they also eat each other. And this is part of the myths and the stories that are being told about these peoples. So these peoples are in their own world, living their own lives until Europeans showed up and they're like, oh, what? Like, we have no idea what's going on. We have no idea how these people function. So they come up with shorthands. And so they go back to Marco Polo, they go back to Herodotus and create these narratives of difference, you know? And what happens is that these images in print and in books get translated into other forms of print culture. You can see this in a map. You have Europe, Africa, and the shapeless New World here. It's being discovered. You see latitude and longitude, you see distance. But what's most important is that this is not an empty land. This is a land filled with wild, savage, super beasts and also cannibals who eat each other, you know? They're just kind of like wild and savage. So little by little, in 1544, you have these same types of images in other maps, and it just is a trope that gets repeated time and time again. So little by little, this fiction starts to become a fact. And not long after, it becomes a science. If you see in this image, there's longitude lines, there's latitude lines, there's divisions of the world, there's distance, there's like a north sign, and you have these ethnographic markings on the sides, you have the places, you have the cities up here. This is all science by this point. It no longer is something that can be contested and say like, oh, that's not true. It's like at this point, these images, these tropes have been reused and recycled hundreds of times that by the time we get to the 1800s, they're science. You see here skulls to mark difference. You see colors to differentiate between races. And once we get to this early nation building points, like not only are we divided by races and nations, we also have images that help us tell each other, and it's very specific. So why all of this matters is not necessarily like representation or distortion of facts, but because at the end of the day, what is at stake here is who owns this land, this new world that has been found, who gets to keep it and who gets to exploit it and get the resources out of there. This is a very complicated history, but at the end of the day, it's always the Europeans who, through law and legality and print culture and writing, were able to establish themselves as the rightful owners of this land. And what happens is that all indigenous points of views, all indigenous perspective and epistemologies get distorted and dismissed. As we see here, this is 1594, Theodore de Bry, and this is supposed to be Native Americans and their dances, which they use at their high feasts, meaning like they're witless, like it's just like nonsense, So like their ultimate perspectives, their religion, their spirituality is dismissed as kind of like, oh, we don't know what they're doing. They just kind of are crazy. They dance around in circles. And they're cannibals, At the end of the day, it's always about who is, they eat each other, they celebrate the sun, they are destroying each other's lives. And the emphasis for the Europeans, it's always conversion. It's always like, we have to educate these people, we have to save their souls. God is about to come again. Like this is the second rupture, the rupture. So we need to make sure that everybody's ready, including these people. Oh, and by the way, we get to control their lands. We see this time and time again where ultimately indigenous peoples resisted the Europeans. They didn't just let them take over. And we see here time and time again, indigenous people stood up for themselves, stood up for their beliefs. And all of this ultimately gets rendered as just they're wild, they're savage, they have no idea, and we have to instill the right religion onto them. So always resistance is what determines that these people are wild, that they're savages, and that they are cannibals. And little by little, these things become truth. And we see here the Europeans get to be scientific, looking at the world. They are masters of all of this. And indigenous people's beliefs and everything else gets dismissed as mere cannibalism. They're eating legs and they're eating each other. And this is not something that just went away. These are tropes that continue to this day. As we can see from cinema, the idea of the cannibal is one that exists to this day. And to end, I think it's important to keep in mind that the question of whether the Caribs were cannibals distracts from the greater issues. When Columbus says that he met Arawaks that said these were Caribs and that they were man-eaters, we don't even know if that's what they meant to say. Columbus is acting like and writing like everything is happening in a dialogue, when in reality, everything that he's writing down is his own thoughts and what he thinks these people are saying. So if the Arawaks did mean to say that the Caribs were man-eaters, every example of cannibalism in the Americas is justified through their worldviews, through their epistemologies, religions, and spiritualities. It's not like, oh, I'm just gonna eat this finger because it's delicious. It was more like, the spirits tell me that this finger contains some type of energy, and by consuming it, I'm able to regenerate that energy and put it out into the world. And these are very large world systems where even if cannibalism did happen, it was always spiritually motivated, and it wasn't for survival or anything like that. And ultimately, the Europeans used these acts of cannibalism as the reason for them to intervene. But the supposed violence of native eating native doesn't compare to the ultimate violence of Europeans colonizing natives in the names of saving their soul. It was disastrous. It was essentially an extermination of an entire people's and entire ways of looking at the world and thinking about it. So to think of this violence just in terms of the goriness and the gruesomeness really erases a lot of the facts. And ultimately, every case of attributed cannibalism in the Americas is contested. There's not a lot of proof or definitive proof that Native Americans did practice, if they practiced, and the only cases where we do have that cannibalism happened was in the case of European colonists who suffered in snow and were snowed in and wanted to survive, as happened in Jamestown and happened in the Donner Pass. So, as always, history is filled with silences. Cannibals, in a way, are a European invention, just like the Indians are a European invention. All of this happens through print culture, through images, and it's important to be aware of these things just to be able to create future possibilities and to make sure that we can move forward and try to right some of the wrongs from the past. As always, stay tuned for our upcoming videos, lessons, and reactions. We have a lot of content planned. I hope that you enjoyed this. Please let me know in the comments below if you have any questions, if there were any mistakes, if you would like to hear more about a specific subject, just let us know and we'll get back to you.